And the next program we have is the part 1, election and data journalism. So we will spend the morning for the data journalism in relation to the elections. And this part will be presided by me again. And also in the afternoon, in the part 2 and part 3, we also have our designated moderators for them separately. We now will invite Ms. Seulgi, data journalist of MBC, and Professor Park Jong-hee of Seoul National University. They're going to have the presentation together. When academy and journalism meet, they investigate polls. I'd like to give you the brief introduction of their bios. Professor Park Jong-hee is studying and teaching the international political relations in Seoul National University. He's also a time series expert as well as the data. And Ms. Jang Seulgi is a journalist in MBC, and she is a graduate of PolLab of Seoul National University, and also she is a producer of many articles in that regard. Ms. Jang first. Good morning, my name is Jang Seulgi, and today I'm going to talk about the meeting between the academy and journalism. We are going to have the investigation onto the role. So we had our English title, When Journalism Meets Academia. You must have a hard time in listening to English so far. I'm going to have a very silly joke. You have the recollection of the movie When Harry Met Sally, or When Coffee or Bagel as other two films. So both of them can be a recollection of yours, and these two things can meet together and can be pairs. And that's the analogy of mine to give you when journalism meets academia. Along with Professor Park Jong-hee, I am running the site. It's like the storyboard line, and also we have decoration in that sense. Currently, we are working on the presidential election for next year. We are trying very hard to show you as much as possible for the elections. Our effort is exceeding your expectation, I have to say. So we are spending a lot of money as well for this site. There's one criticism that I can avoid. Probably we are centering on the journalism like a horse race. This is the kind of criticism we cannot avoid because we are making the popularity contained in the system, and also rather than talking about the manifestos of the presidential candidates, we are trying to just run through the whole process, just like horse racing. We might be like the horses, according to many. The other reason for people say that this is like journalism, like horse race, also say that the media is also one part of the whole group, and media is also running and using the people's minds as well. So the raison d'etre of the media is now in crisis, I have to say. Therefore, my site, along with Professor Park, will be meaningful to avoid such criticism. Like in the past, today people are saying that the poll is not accurate. So we also had extremes in this regard as well. Along with the MBC, we had this particular candidate research which has had so many differences and variances according to the surveyors. The top one is company A and the bottom one is company B. These two pollsters are doing the research and surveys according to the time frame. They are working on the same presidential candidate, Mr. Yoon Sung-ryul. As you see, the variations are so large and nobody can believe what is going to stay. So that's what the general public says, that we are not convinced of polls at all. So the polls are done for these people, but polls are also done by the media. That's another source of criticism. And also only this year we had a lot of heated discussion about the roles of the polls. It's like the wagging the dog, and also you were just having the vicious circle coming up, the media polling together, and the polling is made by the media. This is a one vicious circle. So we have to go beyond this vicious cycle to see the real stories and real sentiment of the people by having the right selection of the polls in order to make polls believable and also trustworthy to the general public. We have our project. Korea is not the exception because other countries are doing the same things as well. Collaborations amongst academia and journalism are made by other countries as well. I was thinking in the beginning, can the journalism do this alone? But my answer to this question is that no, we cannot do this alone. Journalism itself is not so much convinced at the moment. Therefore, people do not believe what we say. Therefore, we need professors from the academia. Secondly, the gurus are quite important in making them believable. I told you that we are collaborating with the academia, with professors. We also have the company MBC for some kind of sites related to the political affairs. When we share the URL, so they say that, can we really trust what they say? This is MBC. I say to you, you can trust it. This is very objective, even though it's under MBC. You can believe what we say. So this is by the media, but media in itself is not so much powerful in terms of our convincibility. That's why we asked Professor Park to work together with us. Let's watch this, but bear with me a moment.
So before we see the video, we have a Bayesian package, we'll say MCA pack, and the person who helped us make this pack was Professor Park Jong-hee, and that's how journalism met academia. And doesn't it look just perfect? There we go. That's the page that I was looking for. So allow me to tell you how we've done this. So Real Meter on Monday and Gallup on Friday and MBC on Tuesday conduct these kind of polling, and we take into consideration the regular polls together with all polls that need to be registered at the National Election Survey Deliberation Commission. And these polls are about the assessment of presidential performance of President Moon. And with regards to that, they don't have to be registered at the National Election Survey Deliberation Commission, but we've nevertheless included them. So, once a week, Korea Research would upload this poll, and other company or organization would upload this poll. And so we take data from these two sources, and my team collects the data, and data analysis is done by the academia or Professor Park Jong-hee, and the contents creation is done again by our team. So does it have a value as a coverage for it to be broadcasted every day? That's one question that we raised, and the answer was no. So 4mbc.co.kr is the website that we published these results. And long-form articles will be written online, or the outcome would also be broadcasted on a show called Pre-Desk on YouTube. And during the elections, of course, it will be aired on TV. So data analysis is done by Professor Park Jong-hee, and he will come to the stage to tell us as to how he does this. But let me just first tell you how we do data collection. So the data that comes to the commission is in this format. You see the figures that are highlighted in light blue, and those are recognized as image files, and so they're not machine readable, and they can't be even downloaded. So to write a mechanical code that would extract this was just so difficult to make, and we thought, the manual way to do this would be the fastest way. So we input these figures manually today. And of course, there are some people who are skeptical about the manual way of doing things, but we haven't found an alternative yet. Then all polling organizations have different these tables that for us to input all of them in a mechanical way or through the machine. is impossible because that means we would have to write 50 codes for each organization. Because there are 50 organizations, so that got us reluctant to write the code. So anyway, things are done manually at the moment. So if you look at the data that we collected, they are this long, and these are just data pertaining to the assessment of presidential performance, and it's this long. And based on this Google spreadsheet, we exchanged data with Professor Park Jong-hee. So let me tell you how many we collected. So starting from May in 2017, when the Moon administration was launched, that was when so that's the date. The earliest date of the data that we collected, and we have 1,301 assessments of presidential performance and 1,177 data of level of support for the parties and 463 and more data for level of preferences for presidential candidates. And as I said before, we have some data that are not registered within the National Election Survey Deliberation Commission. So maybe doing 1.5 times of this figure would be give the accurate number of data that we are dealing with. And we have collected these data. And this is as far as I can disclose today. And we only disclose the specifics of the data to people who really need it. And as I said before, some of these opinion polls, people don't trust them. So what we did was take into consideration of the trend of the polling and also the inclination of these polling organizations. And Professor Park Jong-hee will elaborate this. And he is the person who is most adept at Bayesian model here in Korea. MCM PAC is something that I'm sure that all of you who are involved in Bayesian model have used, and he partook in creating that package. And I knocked on his door several times for him to cooperate with us, and it's an honor for me to work with him. So let's now invite Professor Park Jong-hee to the stage. It's a pleasure to meet you as introduced. My name is Park Jong-hee. I'm a professor at the Department of Political Science and International Relations at Seoul National University. I don't have a lot of time given to me, so I can't give you the specifics, but in this short amount of time, I will just give you an overview of what we're doing in terms of its methodology and background. And by using this methodology, what kind of analysis can we do? I think that's the most important part. You know, there are topics that we're really curious about and sensitive. We can view them from different lenses, but I really think that dynamic linear regression, dynamic linear model, Bayesian dynamic linear model can be a help to that. And the uncertainties of the data and the models were accurately reflected in the answers. So our answers are quite scientific. So the journalists and the academia have worked together to find the most desired answer. And Make Polling Data Great Again is the title of my presentation. And these days, there's an increasing distrust towards opinion polls, which happens at every election. The camps raise criticisms, and the electorates raise criticism against these opinion polls. But rotten apples exist everywhere, and so wrong survey practices are prevalent. That's true. But what I want to tell you through this presentation is that when we look at the industry as a whole, the opinion polling that is done here in Korea is going towards a very desirable path. So I started this analysis back in 2012 when I came back to Korea, and there was a big event going on in Korea back then. You know, there was the presidential election, and Park Geun-hye and Moon Jae-in were fighting against each other. And this is This is the screen capture of the analysis that was done in terms of the support level of those two candidates. And 0.517 was the difference between those two candidates, which would allow Park Geun-hye to win. So, but if we were to collect all the candidates and not just these two candidates, the figure was 0.516. But nevertheless, I thought that this would be very significant, and we dove into the analysis. And during the 2019 elections, we conducted analysis together with Hangyeol newspaper, and depending on the opinion poll, we predicted the outcome of the election in different areas, and this reflects the outcome of the past elections as well as the number of population. So the closer it becomes to 45Y, the higher probability that this candidate has in winning, and these graphs were highly accurate. And the outcome of Dongjak or of Seoul, for example, was 53.67, and the error difference was only minus 0.66%. So these election predictions can be very accurate using these methods, because not only because the opinion polls are very accurate, but the people who actually answer these opinion polls and people who do take part in the elections are nearly the same. So that's why we have such accurate results. So of course there is hard work done by these polling organizations, but we also have to thank the Korean people who faithfully answered these surveys and actually cast their votes to the presidential candidates. So if you were to look at the opinion polls from the viewpoint of meta investigation, this is something that's been talked about widely these days. And many people are becoming increasingly interested in opinion polls. So meta investigation is about looking at the whole picture, looking at the entire survey. So many people are actually doing that tacitly without maybe even knowing it. But anyway, so rather than looking at the individual's figures of an opinion poll, just look at the trends. And we would have to also take into consideration the surveys or opinion polls that are done by these organizations instead of those ones that were commissioned by other organizations. And the mode of investigation, is it ARS or is it a telephone call, is what makes the greatest difference in the outcome of the opinion poll. So taking these into consideration would enable you to filter out the noises in the outcome of the opinion polls. The other ones are a bit more context. The many decisions made by different organizations impact the outcome of the opinion poll systematically. So these are all revealed through researches. And lastly, I would like to emphasize that, like I said, these polling organizations carry out their own opinion polls, and sometimes they are commissioned to do these opinion polls, and the figure varies, of course, or the proportion varies. But if they are commissioned to do a certain polling, then who is the company that commissioned them? We need to figure that out. And what their relationship is. Does a certain company always commission this certain polling organization with no particular reason? Then that could be a cause for a bias as well. So when conducting the analysis, we would use this kind of model. So with regards to candidate A, the opinion or survey organization I got commissioned from company J to conduct this opinion poll using the methodology of K at a time T. So it's a very complex formula, but we have this formula of Y, I, J, K, T, and they do have bias, and we do take these biases into account, and taking into consideration the outcome of the survey, we would reflect them in the model. So there will be the effect by the polling organization I, and effect added by the company that commissioned this polling, J, and there must be an effect in play in terms of the interaction between I and J. And what is the methodology? Is it a telephone call or is it an ARS? So the survey methodology could become a variable or could come into play. And there is something called the menu effect. I'm going to talk about this in the later part of my presentation. And lastly, what's in blue is that we need to look at the trends in the opinion poll, which I did in my work with MBC. This can filter out the noise. And so how this talks about how the trends in the public opinion changes. And what's in purple is that all these values are not fixed, but they change consistently. So there is a random noise in the distribution. We must take that into account. So the survey organization effect has already been investigated by many researchers across the world, and there's something also called menu effect. So depending on what candidate is in or not in the picture, the outcome of the survey can change, and that needs to be taken into consideration. And the company that commissioned this survey, what kind of effect do they have in place? So depending on who commissioned this poll, the outcome of the poll can change greatly, and that also needs to be taken into consideration. So if we are to filter out the noise, how would that look like? So this is a graph showing the assessment of presidential performance with regards to President Moon Jae-in, a positive assessment. So this is called a net approval rating, and as you can see, the public can change their opinions in this given time frame, and that can change the outcome of the election. So as you can see, the assessment is still in the negative area today, and this is the survey frequency. So we say that if it goes, from Lee Jae-myung, the candidate Lee Jae-myung, and if it goes near 30%, the candidate would have higher chance of winning the presidential election. And for the past 2 to 3 years, Lee Jae-myung has gone from 10% to 30%. And with regards to Lee Na-kyung, in January of 2021, his support rating fell, but if you look at this at the starting from mid-2020, his support has been falling already, and we see that change continuing to 2021. And with regards to Yoon Sung-yeol, he was not part of the presidential candidate, but he's become one very recently, and he has a high support. And you can see that his graph is steeping up. So, like I said before, we have eliminated the noises in these graphs to reflect the opinions of the public. And now for Hong Joon-pyo, it's very interesting. He has shown some low support level until very recently, but the graph climbed up at a very steep angle, as you can see. So he is rapidly gaining the support of the public. So I don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to raise some short questions. So whether it's ARS or telephone call, if we were to look at these methodologies separately, then what kind of different trends can we find? With regards to Lee Jae-myung, the blue is telephone call and red is ARS. As you can see, they have remained around the same, and now it's about 2 to 3% difference. Today, ARS and telephone call don't really show a lot of differences. With regards to Lee Na-kyung, the outcome is around the same. Of course, there were times when the telephone call had higher support rate, but it's about the same. But with regards to Yoon Sung-yeol, candidate Yoon Sung-yeol, as I pointed out before, the ARS methodology far exceeded the support level of the telephone call support rate. So who needs to answer this? I think it is the polling organizations who have accountability in making clarifications for this. And as for Hong Jun-pyo, yes, ARS is a bit higher, but there's no big difference. And these two methodologies have shown similar patterns, but recently they have shown some bit differences. And ARS methodology is the one that have shown a higher level of support, and the gap is pretty big. So I hope that the organization will also address this. So now, if we are to look at the effect of the methodology of the survey, so if you look at the support of Yoon Sung-yeol, it's overly assessed, whereas also that's the case for Lee Na-kyun in terms of ARS. And if we look at the telephone, the Lee Na-kyun is the one who is excessively assessed. But as you can see, most of the candidates remain at the 95% credibility level. So compared to telephone call, ARS has greater bias, and that bias is shown especially in some candidates, and this should be explained not by the camps of these candidates but the polling organizations. Now let's look at the presidential support level. So telephone call is at a higher rate than ARS, and that trend was strong recently, but these days there is hardly any difference. Why is that? Then why is the bias that does not exist with regards to the president appearing with regards to presidential candidates? So we need clarification for that. So house effects and client effects, I would like to explain them very briefly. So as you can see, there's a great gap between the polling organizations, and what needs to be taken into consideration is that we don't know whose outcome will be the closest to the actual presidential election outcome. So that was the case in the United States. So there is no true value yet. But how come there is so much differences in the outcome of the survey in case of specific organizations? They need to address this issue. In case of Yoon Sung-yeol, the difference, as you can see, is great compared to other candidates. Well, it could be that it's because Yoon Sung-yeol has just joined the political circles, and maybe that's attributable to this kind of great gap, but we will really have to address this. As for the manual effect, red refers to the benefit that other candidates receive when a certain candidate drops out of the race and so on. So I don't have details to describe the picture, and I will conclude my presentation in a minute. So then what about the two-way race investigation? We would put Lee Jae-myung as part of the survey and include other candidates to see the outcome of the competition between the two candidates. So now let's look at the competition between Lee Jae-myung and Yoon Sung-yeol. As seen earlier, in some specific polling organizations, we see some figures that really stand out. But if you look at the range of the x-axis in case of Yoon Sung-yeol, I'm sorry, I can't see this closely, but we see these values that have a big difference compared to the values of other polling organizations. But instead of large-sized organizations or organizations that have had close relationship with these candidates for a long time, it is usually the organizations that were commissioned by small-scale companies that have shown these differentiating figures. So that was something that was worth noting. And with regards to competition between Hong Jun-pyo and Lee Jae-myung, again, there were some figures that differed greatly from the figures of other companies. So based on the data collected by MBC and of course the responses of the public, and by using statistical models, we were able to conduct many analyses to see such trends, and we would like to provide a guidance to the polling organizations so that they would guide the public in the right direction. Thank you very much.
네, 그럼 지금부터 저희
Thank you very much. From now on, we'd like to have the Q&A session to show you how collaboration has been made between the academia and journalism. This kind of collaboration is actually not new. It has been old, but there are challenges as well in doing this. So can we also show our PPT to the audience as well? Now, the question number 1.
아무래도 교수님께서
This goes to Professor Park. Professor Park has been doing this job along with the journalist media. I believe that you must have faced some challenges. Can you explain what kind of challenges have you experienced in dealing with the collaboration with the journalism media like us? Yes. Basically speaking, I believe that the journalism and academia have different approaches to deal with the data and analysis. The journalism also requires accuracy as well as the fast speed. However, the academicians like me and the university are quite lazy. So we want to be accurate as much as possible. That's our very good excuse. And if we want to just speed up our processes, we believe that there can be some kind of errors of the coding and so on. Therefore, we are just collaborating to meet in the halfway. No matter what automation we are using for the coding, in our analysis, we have outliers, we have coding errors, and other unexpected problems and glitches. Every time we meet with these problems, we have to be very agile in dealing with the issues. The academicians are less trained in terms of dealing with the fast speed, so we had trials and errors in this regard. However, having said that, I believe the collaboration is needed and important only because of that as well. Because the media really wants to be objective and accurate, but their wish is not so much met. And also, they can be complemented by the academicians like us in order to have more accuracy as well in the future. So collaboration is quite more needed in the future as well. Let me go on. In the case of journalism and media, we have our challenges dealing with the academicians. I was gonna say this. In the time of the journalism and the time of the academicians, our time gaps are too much. We are different because the journalism is running so fast and we are running around while the academicians are just stable. We have to be nimble in terms of the posting our articles faster than anybody else. So it's kind of competition of time. So as you said before, by using academicians, we can have the safety breaks as well. Also, we have our chances to discuss these matters with the other people who are most robust in their ideas. So we were able to have the insights from the academicians. If we want to call it a collaboration, this kind of collaboration should be met in the halfway, as you said, in terms of timing. It will mean some sacrifice by both sides. Probably we have derivative question. Then the next page, it's kind of like storm in the cup. It's like the males in their 20s, that can be a social phenomena. This is quite a phenomenal graph here. So can we really trust this? Like the blue line, which are the males in their 20s, do they really behave very egoistically if they are rich? because they say they do not want to make donations when they are very rich. This kind of results of this graph, and they can be a result of the miscommunications or the lack of understanding. What do you think about that? Before talking about this graph in more detail, I would like to tell you that this is a disaster of outsourcing. For example, a special particular company can be specialized in the legal affairs. They can be commissioned by a company, and if there is a commitment of the legal matters, there must be a group or department of the legal processes in a company. So if a journalism media is responsible for this kind of graph and then outsourcing these projects from other third-party companies, and they have to be responsible for the processing and also getting the interpretation of the data. If they had the department specialized for the analysis of the raw data, they will not have this kind of disaster. I believe this is a disaster of the outsourcing because there was not a department in the company to have the interpretation of the raw materials. And also the company was very free from the responsibility because the raw material providers were in the the criticism. So all the professors providing this raw material was in the hot seat. The problem I find here is as follows. It sometimes is talked about that there was a intention of this graph to demonize the males in their 20s. I don't know, and I cannot have any say about this, but I want to say that the only thing I can tell you is that there was a misunderstanding of the raw data from this collection. And then also there was no raw data in the teenagers of the males. They should not have any dots here, but they put the dots here anyway. And why is that? We have to know why. Is that they just want to have the streamline of these whole graph. And we had a second thought about this graph. When we did the second model, actually there was no different from this because they did not have the dots for the 90s. And also we have to talk about the confidence interval. And why is confidence interval important? It's because it can deliver the accuracy the best way to make it more convincible. So the default should not be omitted if you really want to have the high degree of the confidence interval. So confidence interval should be included in any kind of graph. Yes, thank you. So in the poll -MBC poll actually has the confidence interval included. That was kind of advertisement for all the audience. One thing I regretted a lot about looking at this graph of the males in their 20s as a novice reporter, it might be very difficult for the novice reporter to have a clear understanding of the graph. In that case, that novice reporter can ask questions to the experts like professors and so on. I didn't know what happened behind the scene, so I cannot say more, but there can be some times when there is no overlapping interest between the journalism and the academicians. For example, they can disagree and disagree. For example, regressive analysis is very difficult to be broadcasted, and I believe that this is the most difficult one that can be carried on the terrestrial television. The broadcasting means that everything is just flipping away very quickly, so we were not able to be thorough about checking everything before carrying them on the television. So we have some improvements to make. But before putting it on the program, there must have been some kind of checking system or finer checking system so that they can be proven to be true. And as Professor Park said, without confidence interval, it cannot be trusted. That's the comment we can make before the finer moment of making it into the program. So it's not about who's winning and who's losing, because we are just showing that this is something that we really showed others. And it is very difficult to convince the bosses of the television, and also it is very difficult to make the consensus. But this kind of making consensus is our homework to do in the future, both the journalism and the academicians. So another question, is it good to have a collaboration? Do you think so?
Yes, of course. I think collaboration is good. So the journalism needs academia, and academia also needs journalism. And data-based information will be increasingly used in news reportings going forward. So the academia would have to find a way for the readers to easily understand and also to make sure that the outcomes are supported by scientific grounds. And of course, we need the materials, we need the data. A lot of scholars are always hungry for materials and data. And so the media can really provide us with quality data. And through data, we can attain credibility. So I believe that the collaboration in these two disciplines will increase in the future. So it's the same for journalism as well, because we have to put out stories that differentiates ours from that of others, but we face limitations in doing that. We have limited thoughts, and so on. So we would collaborate with not only academia, but also civil society and so on to get help. But as you said, we do not need to develop an attitude that the academia is working for us, but we are working in partnership. So maybe there are some parts where not journalism, but academia could take lead in, which might produce some more quality stories. So that was just a self-introspection on my part, or the journalism's part. So that's the end of our talk, and we'll address some questions later in the Q&A session. So that was when journalism meets academia, pulling the polls. So that was Jang Seulgi, journalist at MBC, and Professor Park Jong-hee at Seoul National University. We enjoyed your presentations and talks. We also have another presentation for this session 1 about the case of election report. And a journalist at Newstapa will tell us how election report has been done at Newstapa, especially based on the analysis of voting propensity by voting district. And the presentation will be given by Ms. Yeon Da-Hye. And let me just tell you who she is very briefly. In 2016, she joined Newstapa as data journalist, and she has conducted many projects like the taxation issue and corruption in the National Assembly, and she has also been involved in many investigative reports that are based on data. And other than that, she has conducted online education on data journalism at Newstapa. So now let's listen to her presentation.
Good morning. As was introduced, my name is Yeon Da-Hye from Newstapa. I'm going to give you the example of the election reporting, which was the analysis of the propensities of the election by district. I have a question to you. When you receive a calendar for the next year, what do you do for the first time? I'm checking when is the election day of the year after. As a reporter, election is quite an important event, maybe the most important thing for the reporters to cover. And then I look at when is the local elections and by-elections and so on. So if I am working for an election team, I will be more meticulous about this. But even if I'm not working for the election team, I'm always careful to look at the schedules of the elections. I've been working as a reporter for 6 years so far. Every year we had some sort of elections. And also every year we were kind of making preparations for covering elections, in other words. Any journalist would agree that this is a quite important event. I'm talking about the elections. So when we talk about the articles on elections, you will have the recollections of the polls approval rate, and so on. As time goes by, you will be also interested in the articles about the property of the candidate's age and the number of terms elected. And also after the election is finished, we have ballot counting broadcast as well. They also have a lot of speeches and the policy debates and mentions at the social network. We can also use the GIS system to know where they are going in terms of the local electioneering. Election is full of data, and it is quite a good source of data. In this regard, I always have our ongoing question: what do we have to do? What does Newstapa has to do as an independent media? This year, I was not involved in the election team. I didn't have to write an article about election. However, if after an election is finished, every attention is given to an election. When I was preparing for my job, I always thought that I was not doing my job properly. So sometimes I felt uneasy about this. And then in the meantime, I was able to witness my condition. I had all the data for the candidates, and Newstapa did not have the markman, did not cover the sites, and did not have any results of the exit poll results. In that sense, what can we do? And this is the article as a result of our agony, as our status. So we were looking at the data from the poll stations in the 20th general election, and that data was also a source of our further analysis. And the day after, we had the update of the data in each poll station, and then we had another round of rearranging the data by polling station. So this is the result of our articles about the election. And number one is the number one polling station in Hyundai Department in Apgujeong area, and also that is located in the Gangnam-gu area. Out of the candidates, Mr. Oh Se-hoon, as a candidate for the mayor of Seoul City, received the most ballots, while Mr. Park Young-sun, the candidate from the Democratic Party of Korea, had only 100 ballots. That was like 17 times of the ballots to be given to the Oh Se-hoon. Let's look at another analysis. That's the comparison of the 21 polling stations which has the most the ballots for Oh Se-hoon. So this is a list of the apartments, and these are very expensive high-rise buildings where the wealthy people are living. So you will know all the names of these buildings. So these areas, they have the number 1, number 2, number 3, and number 4 ballot stations. They all have the higher number for the Oh Se-hoon candidate, while Ms. Park did not have the much of the ballots here. So this gap between the two candidates is only the 12.3%. However, Oh Se-hoon received much more ballots than Park, and that was the 17 times as witnessed in Hyundai apartment, as I talked before. That is wider gap than in the average of the Seoul. And also, Se-hoon in the 20th general election, he was flying high and 1,449 stations. And also when he was winning for the Democratic Party, the opposition had the 16% difference from the winning party. This time in the 20th by-election, the pendulum has waved to the other direction when the DPT was winning only in 15 places, while the PPP was winning in 1,450 stations. It means that the popularity has just gone from the other way around. The biggest difference comes from the Seongbuk district, and in 2020, the Democratic Party was winning with 12.4% point, while in 2021, they lost by 19.2% point. Kirum area, which is the apartment filled areas, Kirum Newtown Lemian, Kirum Newtown Pyeongan Saesang are the apartment buildings that are most representative here, and they show this trend very dramatically. And also, the smallest variance can be observed in these three districts, and the Gumcheongu, Junggu, and Dobonggu are them, but they are also showing less than 20% of point of the variance. But they did not show any movement from toward the Democratic Party. Out of 2,200 polling stations, they moved to the PPP by more than 10% point. Actually, April 19th in 2019, they showed that there is an increase of the apartment price by 14.75% as released by the Ministry of Land Prices. And the land price was going up while the apartment buildings are also getting more expensive, of course. The three areas, Yangcheon, Gangnam, and Yeongdongpo, are the ones that show the highest jump. And also for the communal residential buildings in Seoul, they also had the increase of the prices by 14.75%, and then they also have the generated more tax payment. And also the Osehun was also very seen visible in these most wealthy areas in Gangnam and Seoul by 20%. So this is the correlation to show you the real estate price in buildings and the election popularity. That is the correlation of the 0.9, and that is also seen here. So in Gangnam area, the Osehun is quite popular, and those areas are quite visible, and that can be proven in here. However, interpretation is another thing, because it's not so easy to have the full understanding. There must be some people who have moved to other party, and also some of the voters might have experienced the increase of their prices, and some of them might have experienced the sacrifices because of the land price they couldn't afford. And also they have to have the ownership of the households to show the trend, but for the journalists like us, it is very difficult for us to know who's owning the house, who's not. For the voters, they can always say that they are angry about not having the subsidy from the government, but without proof, we cannot write those stories on the newspaper. And also we have to look into the details of this data, like for example, every district and also we can say that we are witnessing some of the sentiment toward the opposition party. That's the only thing we can say. Now, this is another example of showing you what kind of processes we are making for having a report. It took me about 2 or up to 4 months to write one article normally. But this article is an exception because it took only 1 day for me to write up. How was it possible? In Newstapa, what is the most important thing is to amass the data. It's more important than writing up a story. We don't know whether this would be important for us, useful for us down the road. Without caring that, we are just collecting the data. We call it archive. This archive is a pool of the collection, control, sharing, and use of the raw data by the members of the data team. We are just amassing all these things. So this is a source of writing this kind of article. So this is an example. I wrote up this article at the end of last year after the election. We did not have the information about the district called like Tong or Pan. We were just using the publicly available data only. Then we just were trying to confirm that these residents were actually the voters. And we moved ahead by having the idea of writing up this kind of story based on the data we had. So we asked for the release of the data to the district authorities to have the residences. But as a result of our asking and requesting, Kwanaku said that they did not have the data, so they gave us the notice of non-existence of data. Didn't make sense at all. Instead, they showed us this one, and after 1 year, the person who answered me from the Kwanak district was fired, and he was replaced by someone else to give me some kind of raw data. Now I was able to write up this story because I was able to get the data from the district. This is the way we were able to amass all the data in 25 districts in Korea. We were able to purify the data to write a story. And we were sharing all the data, so it took only one day. And also as a result of the election, we were able to combine all the data and then share the data for our articles. So I told you that it took only one day to write a story, but behind that we had 1 full years of processes going through. So journalist Kim Kwang-yeon and I were analyzing the data on the election day. On the next day, we were able to have the coverage. And we were just a team of 2. That is why we were able to achieve that in one day. After getting the coverage, we were also getting a lot of the reactions. So the questions from the readers included, like, where are all the supporters of Ha Kyung-yeon? Where did they go? And who's getting the other ballots from the female 20s? And also 15.5% of the number for the females in their 20s. And at that time, there wasn't quite noticeable because we were not exposed to the female data before. And I was interested in that as well. So in preparing for this, I was looking at this because of my curiosity. Ha Kyung-yeon as a candidate, he was just scattered all over. And also Park Kyung-sung was also leading the game. And also we get the feedback, and also the next day, I was thinking that we have to check it more thoroughly. I was not thinking of having another article, but on the lunchtime the next day, I was looking into the all 25 districts for the female candidates and who was voting for them. And I was able to see a very particular trend of these voters for these female candidates, like 1.91% of the voters combined were exhibited by 5 candidates, and we had the 12 areas where the voting ratio was more than 6%, which is the 3 times bigger. And that area was actually full of campuses, especially the women's universities like Ewha and Sukdae. And also the Kim Jin-ah as a candidate, she showed a very particular popularity in the areas where the women's universities are there. Also in Song Myung-suk is another female candidate, and she got the ballots more than 1% in Gwanak-gu and Yeongdeung-pogu. They are not having the campuses, but they have the population of less than 30 years old. So as you see here, all these areas where many young people are residing, they relatively voted more for the female candidates. And also there was only one place where university is not there. That is the number 3 voting station in Sangam-dong in Mapo-gu. They took about 33.5% of the young people, but they didn't vote for the female candidate that much. If I didn't know about the neighborhood, I wouldn't be able to write this story. I looked at the map, and that's full of a lot of office tales like Sangam office tale and so on. I was able to know what the neighborhood was like because I was living there. I was one of the residents there for 3 years. I knew what the neighborhood was like. So they were living amongst other females in their 20s and 30s. I was very confident to carry that article. So after writing all the stories, I had our story. I showed you how I was able to write a story. This is not something particular. This is not so much a sophisticated one. We don't have that much data. But sometimes people say that the value for money is not good for this article writing. And if you spend 1 month for one article, you might say this is correct. But if I was able to make a story one day, like I did, you cannot say that the value for money is not so low. So Newstapa does not have markmen. Newstapa doesn't send people to the sites, but still we were able to do something like this. I was able to witness that I could do that. Thank you very much for sharing the idea with me. Thank you very much. That was Ms. Da-Hye from Newstapa. And she was also presenting us about the popularity trend of the elections by district. While listening to her, we also received many questions from the chat box on the YouTube. Some of the questions are quite in-depth, I find. Probably it would have been not easy to ask such questions. Originally, our intention is to use the Q&A session to have the interactions with the audience. If they ask questions, we can continue our Q&A session. But before we do that, why don't we just have our general discussion together? While doing so, while listening to our discussion, the audience can also put in their questions. In the meantime as well, we will come back to you later. While we are talking, I also received new questions. So it's something like this. In the journalism, the bias can be observed in some of the polling station companies. In order to prevent that from happening, what kind of measures should be made? Professor Park should also mention other usages of the Bayesian statistics models for statistics in order to avoid that. And I was able to see the variance of all the different polling companies. We were able to see the big variance, much bigger variance than normal amongst all the polling stations. Sometimes it's embarrassing. So as mentioned, the results are seemingly based on the bias. In order to improve that problem of bias, what can we do?
So this is not an easy problem because it's a political issue, first of all. But for the scholars, that's not a problem because scholars like us criticize everyone and everything. But just because there is a bias or a gap, can we really objectively say that that is wrong? That's not easy. So what the US does is called 538. So based on the election outcome, they would give scores like A, B, and C, and D. And they also gave F to the companies who refused to provide the materials, and they're not included in the meta investigation. And every time these polling companies announce their outcome, they are to publish the scores right next to the outcome. So I think I can give you two suggestions today. First, so we need to basically give an accurate view of the floating voters. So you will have to not only give the figures for each candidate, but also the floating voters. And we need to make sure that these organizations also compete for the floating voters. So when a candidate is confirmed in a certain party and when there are some political changes, we have this, insight knowing how the floating voters will change. So by knowing specifically about these floating voters, we can reduce the bias. And the pollings that are done today are based on the assumption that everyone in the nation will take part in the election. And together with the exit poll, we will have to combine that with the predictive surveys to get a more accurate outcome. So the only way that a polling organization can say that their figure is accurate is to announce that predictive survey on the day of the election. But I believe that has not been the case so far. And such practices that I suggested would have to be adopted by the polling companies. And, we have these small polling organizations joining the polling opinion polling polls today, and they are not free from the suggestions that I raised. So again, make sure you provide the details of the floating voters, and the outcome of your predictive survey would have to be published on the day of the election so that the public can make the decisions of their own. So you talked about two things, or your answer was in two aspects. So the polling organizations and their methodologies would have to be more transparent. In terms of the floating voters, they would have to be provided in a clear manner. And you did meta investigation with regards to your research. And what Ms. Jang Seulgi said in her presentation is the graph about men in their 20s. And I believe that that was based on a logistic regression analysis. But you are using a Bayesian model. It's a sophisticated statistical tool. So the viewers and the readers would have some difficulties in understanding the outcome of these models. And with regards to the academia and journalism cooperating, I believe you needed to engage in a lot of communication. So based on the presentation, I think the analysis of the model and the data analysis was all done by Professor Park, right? And the one who collected the data and material and organized them was done by Ms. Jang Seulgi at MBC. That was my understanding. And so opinion polls are based on the assumption of those who would participate in the poll, and this is impossible. It's something that only God knows, I believe. But this meta-analysis technique that you are using, so there are many organizations do have their own bias. Yes, that's true. But when we look at the bigger picture, can we say that those are offset?
Yes, he says yes. So speaking of transparency, you talked about it. So from that perspective, if we want to be sure that this is really accurate, and that's based on our trust. However, still, this is a very complicated model. Depending on who's looking at this, it looks like a black box, sort of. Of course, we have to understand the insights of the model only after getting some education. There will be a handful of people taking it as a basics. Maybe you can just explain a little bit more briefly to talk about what you're using. You're using R, and also you are also giving some chances of letting us know. So I think that some U.S. companies are releasing the insights as well. So are you planning to do so? Are you planning to open your codes? Yes, it might be possible. So when we had analysis of the Seoul Ho, the ship sinking accident, we also had our raw materials code giving to the data sense, and that's a data birth. And data birth is the area where we are providing all the raw materials. It's like based on the GitHub. And also the code issues do not have the protocols yet to follow. In my case, while writing up my article or my thesis, I am just releasing my codes. So if you read my article, you can know my sources of the data. And also we have our uses of this data and the journalism as well. I am willing to open my data and the GitHub, even if it's today, I can do that. And also in 2017, when I also wrote another paper, I explained in detail about the metrics of the codes. You're right when you said it's very complicated and people say that it's not transparent, but actually, believe me when I say it's not that complicated. Andre Gelman in Columbia University used the same model when he was predicting the results of the election, and ACES was also using the system, and also the 5 Jack Med was also using the same model in Australian elections. So there are the dynamic linear model of Bayesian statistics, and I was only just adjusting it to fit the Korean situation to have the more zero target, 0 point adjustments. I'm based on the internationally proven or accredited systems. That's all I can say. Well, thank you. Since we are talking about this issue, we have some more questions related to that. While talking about the reports of MBC, Ms. Seulgi can answer this question from the chat box. How do you verify the polls, research, and surveys in MBC? So that's the question.
It's very difficult to answer that question because poll MBC and separate investigations that are done in the political team and so are separated. So I don't really know what's going on in the political team. But if I were to focus on poll MBC, yes, I'm creating that together with Professor Park Jong-hee to pool the polls. And so you use the word bias. So the biases or the differences, we really wanted to eradicate them to make sure that we would clear the understanding of the public reading these data. But what I do want to tell you from the viewpoint of journalism is that I wish that we would draw the graphs well. So, for example, he said that we have to make clear reports about people whose candidacy has not been confirmed yet, but we would give these kind of percentages to certain candidates, and you usually choose the top 2 candidates with the top percentages and ignore the other candidates. But the differences between the 2 candidates, yes, it is important, but we also need to know information about other candidates as well, but those are not expressed in the graphs, and they're not read by audio by the reporters, and it's not reflected in the news articles and so on. But a selective reporting of information value is not a good thing, I believe. And those things that are not reflected in the graph are very important, because if it's like a two-way competition graph, then a lot of it's distorted. So, usually, like, for example, they only take up 80% of the entire picture, but the graphs reflect as if they take up the 100% of the picture, for example. And the readers might just see and think that, oh, so those 2 candidates are the only ones that matter. So we really need to be careful in drawing these graphs. And people who are in charge of these polls are direly needed in the press. So maybe there are people in charge at the political team, but they're not experts in these polls. So when we design the survey and when we receive the survey, we would just rely on the poll organizations, give them commissions, as we said before, and to see what percentages of level of support is for people in different age groups, for example. And when I made a request to our partner company for raw data, they responded with, "What? What do you want?" And they were surprised because, it's not a common practice for us to ask for raw data, for example. So I hope that there is a dedicated personnel at media companies for polls, and especially people who know about analysis and about data, then that would facilitate a smooth conversation. And Professor Park has raised this concern as well. And so maybe someone at the political team has an expertise in this, but I really want to have someone who have expertise joining our team. And 조선일보 is the only one, I believe, who has a dedicated person doing that. But anyway, opinion polls is very important. So maybe if we can't invite experts to the press, then maybe we can give education and training to our existing employees. And the reason why people say is that these opinion polls are wrong is because we do have a time period where the publication of our survey poll is limited or restricted. So what happens over a period of a week or 2 weeks during which the publication is forbidden is not reflected in the survey poll. That's what makes people think that we are wrong, that we have made a mistake. And the people who take part in the survey and people who actually take part in the election may be different people with different attributes. But and sometimes so the survey figures might seem preposterous, but at the day of the election, we actually see that they're close to the actual outcome. So when we assess our opinion poll, not during elections, but for other events, we would have to compare them with the population. And I do believe that people who take part in the survey and also who take part in the ARS survey and telephone survey are people who are likely to actually cast their votes during the election. So yes, ARS can be correct, but of course it can be wrong. But I don't really like to use the word bias. The recipe for different food is different, and depending on how much chili pepper or chili sauce that you put in, the level of spiciness changes in a dish. And I think opinion polls can be viewed in that light. So of course, more number of us would have to assess these opinion polls and their outcomes. But I think we need to make reports on the literacy instead of just using the word bias going forward. So there is a lot of ties in the opinion polls and anyway, so the opinion polls are bound to be the topic of controversy even going forward. So the media will have to play a greater part in calming down those controversies, I believe. Thank you very much for your input. And you said you like to use a different word than the word bias. So, but anyway, it's a statistical term, and that's why we're using the word bias. And when the electorates and the readers, but when they hear the word bias, maybe they would get a different nuance of the term. And we also have different questions being raised via YouTube. So now it's for Newstapa, Miss Da-Hye.
So in case of Newstapa, it is investigative reporting media. So in normal days, you might have some long-term view in your investigative report. But when it comes to election, it might be different because you have to be also fast as well, like other media. So in case of coverage of the election, what is the top priority of Newstapa? Yes. Newstapa, as you know, is investigative reporting media. We have a long-term plan for an article. Actually, in election as well, we are doing the investigative reporting as well for a longer term. The reporting I talked about today, it took only one day. It is an exception, so you might feel different. But we are also very much investigative and also taking long time in the election. We are not covering the behaviors and actions of the candidate every day. We're not following them at all, so we cannot know what they're talking about and what they're doing. That is kind of a limitation to us, but at the same time, it can be an advantage as well. Our problems can be complemented by having earlier planning. For example, in the National Assembly, we also had the reporting of the text analysis of the releases by the National Assembly. In the local elections, we have also the analysis of the jobs in combination with other jobs for the candidates. It covered 3,300 candidates as well. So there's something we only can do. So we are trying to do some things that other media cannot cover. Thank you. So we have the remainder of the time, which is very less, but the number of questions is much bigger than the number of minutes we have. Professor Park, when you do the analysis by polling station, you might have the effect of the organization. You have it as a K effect. So in your own modeling, probably you have to factor into the modalities of each of the poll stations and also the treating the non-answers. So these details are reflected on it as variables, how to do the weighting as well. I don't do the weighting at all. I only put the names of the organizations of the polling and the methodology in the name of the registered to other companies. And also when they report it to the newspaper, we are taking their data as they are, and we have our internal coding. So we don't put any weighting from these polling stations. The only exception is that when we have the prediction in the National Assembly, as we did, if we have the cross table given to us, probably we can see the ratio of the age from here. And also the ratio of age is different when it comes to the actual voting. That's why we put a little bit of weighting at that time, but for other regular jobs, we don't do weighting at all. Yes, the time has elapsed, and this is almost the end of our session.
So really, elections are called the highlight of democracy, or the flower of democracy. But there are, as you mentioned in your presentations, many variables that come into play in the elections. But we are making various attempts driven by data, and we're going through many trials and errors to produce better stories. And I'm sure we can make further improvements going forward. So Professor Park Jong-hee, journalist Jang Seulgi, and journalist Yeon Da-Hye. So data-driven reports is the work that you have done to date, and you have given us some food for thought as to how we can deal with our stories on election based on these data-driven information. And that concludes part 1. And I would like to thank everyone for raising your questions during the Q&A session. And we will have lunchtime now, and part 2 will begin at 1 p.m. So please enjoy your lunch, and thank you very much once again.